I've got a question for you to start with tonight. Anybody know what today is the anniversary of? No? Let's give you a clue. Today is the 477th anniversary of. Yes, sir? No. In fact, it's a little bit more sad than that. It's the 477th anniversary of the death of. Now, I am surprised Heather hasn't jumped up by now, because this memorial is part of the liturgy of the Church of England. Tell you, the parish priests don't always build it into their programme, but today is the 477th anniversary of the death of William Tyndale. Now, I don't know how much you know about William Tyndale. He's best known for his translation of the New Testament and a large part of the Old Testament into English. In fact, about 90% of the King James Bible is Tyndale's work. What they changed was the bit that the kings of England didn't like. And his text, as I said, became the foundation of the King James Bible. He was a native of Gloucester, and he went to Oxford in about 1510, and later he studied at Cambridge. He wasn't a peasant, as you gather from that. He could speak 7 languages, and he was proficient in Hebrew and Greek. He was a priest, and should he have wished, his intellectual abilities could have taken him a long way in the church. But there was a problem. Back in those days, state and church were very much intertwined. And they were the power brokers of the day. And between them, they liked to keep the population quiet. And church services back then, in these medieval periods, which is the link with the Damson Fair, were in Latin. And one of the reasons they were in Latin was because then it wasn't in the people's language. And they couldn't know what was going on. And that kept them in the lower levels. But it also kept them knowing about Jesus Christ. And Tyndale's main compulsion, he wanted to teach English men and women the good news of justification by faith in Jesus Christ. In 1523, he foolishly perhaps went and asked the Bishop of London for permission and funding to translate the New Testament into English. The bishop did not give him a polite answer, and Tyndale soon realised that the project would not be possible in England. He therefore moved to the continent, where some of the cities, because of the Reformation, were already free from the influence of the Roman Church. But then he made a mistake, or some people could see it as a mistake, because it was at the time when Henry VIII was wanting to divorce Catherine of Aragon, and Tyndale wrote a pamphlet and said he shouldn't be doing it, and Henry wasn't well pleased. He got on with his work though, and in 1525 his New Testament was published, and it was the first translation into English from the Greek. All the others had been taken from the Latin and so on. And he also made use of the new technology of the printing presses. But besides getting Henry angry with him, he was now making enemies of the Pope. As his English Bible began to circulate, it was smuggled into the country, and people began to read it, and the Pope did not like that. And Cardinal Wolsey condemned Tyndale as a heretic in 1529. He was betrayed to the imperial authorities in Antwerp in 1535, and, as I said, he met his death 477 years ago, according to Fox's Book of Martyrs, on the 6th of October after being charged with heresy, and he was condemned to be burned to death. And he was actually said that they would strangle him first as an act of mercy, but the hangman, who you can see there strangling him, made a bad job of it, and he revived just as the flames were beginning to come up. But I don't know whether you see it. Back then, this is from Fox's Books and Marches, they didn't have speech balloons, they had speech banners. And there's a banner there with perhaps his most famous quote in it. It says, "Lord, open the eyes, open the King of England's eyes." That was his dying prayer, that the King of England would see the importance of the Bible. This is a long quote. I'll read it to you and then tell you who said it, because you might not be able to see that at the bottom. It appeared in the Telegraph, June this year. "We are all in Tyndale's debt. He grounded our language. He gave to Protestantism a subtlety and fury which blazed its message across the continent. Most spectacular among the American slaves, who took songs and sentences from it around which they formed their campaign for freedom. He has given to literature for centuries a vocabulary and a sense of rhythm and clarity that flows through the work of so many, from John Donne to Bob Dylan. And almost as an accidental byproduct, he loaded our speech with more everyday phrases than any other writer before or since. We still use them, varieties of them, every day, 500 years on." In case you've been able to pick it up, Melvin Bragg wrote that. On the same day, he hosted a programme on BBC Two called "The Most Dangerous Man in Tudor England." And it was a tribute. But why would somebody like Melvin Bragg, who says he's an atheist, want to speak so proudly of a Christian? Well, he thinks it was because he did a lot for the English language. But I've got a question for you. Do you think that Tyndale was willing to die burnt at the stake as a heretic because he wanted to improve the English language? No, he had other ideas. And one of the... there we are. And one of the things which motivated them, perhaps his second most famous quote, is that while he was in this country, before he went to the continent, he was often in arguments with senior clerics. And one of them said to him, "We had better be without God's laws than the Pope's." And Tyndale wasn't pleased at that, and he said, "I defy the Pope and all his laws. And if God spares my life many years, I will cause the boy that driveth the plough to know more of the Scriptures than thou dost." And in those days, ploughboys couldn't read. And Tyndale was saying that his objective was to motivate the most humblest person in the country to know the Scriptures. Some other quotes you may not have come across from Tyndale. This is one where he says there's no better work than to please God. Whether you're pouring out waters, washing dishes, being a cobbler or an apostle, they're all the same. To wash dishes and to preach are all one, as touching the deed, to please God. Tyndale's motivation was to please God. And why was he so bothered about the Scriptures? Well, here's another quote from him. Talking about the Bible, he says, "To see how Christ was prophesied and described therein, consider and mark how that kid or lamb must be without spot or blemish. And so was Christ, only of all mankind, in the sight of God and his law." So Tyndale saw that in the Bible there was lots of things that pointed to Jesus Christ. And it was that he wanted people to see. Now here is a quote from the passage Mary read to us. Let me set that in context for you, because it's very similar to Tyndale's argument, I think. his argument with the religious authorities of the day. In John chapter 5, we have the story of the healing of a man at a pool. And what's unusual about that story is most healings in the New Testament that Jesus did, people came up to him saying, Lord, heal me, be merciful on me, heal me. But in John chapter 5, the man is lying by a pool, and Jesus goes up to him and says, do you want to be healed? And the man doesn't give him a straight answer. He just says, I've got nobody to put me in the pool. And Jesus doesn't mess around. He says, oh, look, pick up your bed and walk and go home. But when you think about it, he motivated that event. And he was either a fool or he had a purpose. Because that day when he did that was the Sabbath. And if he wanted to be very wise, he might have healed that man on another day. He could have waited another 24 hours. He'd waited years. Or he might have said to him, you're healed, but because it's the Sabbath, don't tell anybody, come back and get your bed tomorrow. Because that was work, and he knew that would rile the Pharisees. But what did he do? He said, take up your bed and walk. And chapter 5 marks 5 or 6 chapters in John. It's the start of 5 or 6 chapters where Jesus is continually arguing with the Pharisees about what real faith in God is about. And here, towards the end of this argument, on this day when he'd healed a man who couldn't walk and had been lame for ages, he's arguing with the Pharisees, who are the great religious men of the day. They know the scriptures backwards. And he says to them, you search the scriptures, for in them you think you have eternal life. And these are they which testify of me. But you're not willing to come to me that you may have life. Tyndale says, you read about the sacrifices in the Old Testament. They point to Jesus. Here, Jesus is saying this is what the scriptures do. He's talking about the Hebrew scriptures, of course. They point to me. I like to say the scriptures are full of signposts. Here's one of them. You may remember signposts like that. That's from Genesis 1:3. It says, let there be light. The first things we know that God said after the creation of the world. And of course, Jesus, when he came, said, I am the light of the world. Another one for you. The day man sinned, God's talking to the woman. And he says, I will put enmity, he's talking to Satan, and he says, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. A very clear prophecy about what Jesus would do at Calvary. Here's another old sign for you that's in the Old Testament. Abraham's going up to sacrifice with his son, and the son looks round and says, Dad, we haven't got an animal. And Abraham says, behold. So it says, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering. 2,000 years later, John the Baptist stands there and says to people, behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world, and points at Jesus. Here's another one. I don't know whether you know that the Jews had a practice. They learnt the scriptures by memory. And often when they were reciting them, they would speak out the first verse of a psalm or a passage. Then they would go through it in their heads. And then when they got to the last verse, they would speak it out. And Psalm 22 starts with the phrase, my God, why have you forsaken me? And that's what Jesus said when he was put on the cross at Calvary. He cries out with a loud voice, why, my God, why have you forsaken me? And if you read Psalm 22, you'll come across lots of phrases that crop up while Jesus is on the cross. But his very last words are, it is finished. which is the last phrase translated slightly different of Psalm 22. He has performed it. My final road sign for tonight, is a whole chapter. It's Isaiah 53, but I haven't gone all that way. Just one verse from it. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned every one to his own way. And the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. Peter summed that up in a different way. For Christ also suffered once for sins, the just for the unjust, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but made alive by the Spirit. Let's move on to the passage I read, Psalm 119. That section opens with this phrase, your word is a lamp to my feet and a light to my path. Of course, back then the writer was saying, when you speak to me, God, it shows me where I should go. And today, God speaks most often through the scriptures. Jesus in the New Testament gave a description of himself that began with, I am the way, the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. The way, the path, very much the same thing. Here's a path. Very easy to see because it's daylight. Now, some years ago, I heard a man speak who came up with a very wonderful example, and I want to tell you about that. But to introduce it, I want to tell you about a friend of our eldest daughter's. Joanna, our eldest daughter, has been to Africa several times with a Christian charity doing work over there, and the husband, the guy who leads it, lives out there for periods with his family. And one night, the wife in this family, after it had gone dark, had remembered they were having some pit, I can't remember what it was for, dug at the side of the house. And she remembered it hadn't been covered up, and she thought that could be dangerous. I will go out there and I will cover it up. But it was already dark. And she didn't take anything with her to show her where the pit was. Do you know what happened? She fell down it. Had to be rushed to an African hospital, which is not a good experience. And she had to be flown home and spent quite a lot of time very poorly. Now, I don't want to do her down, but if she'd have gone out in the daylight and she could see where the hole was, she could have seen where she was going. But going out at night, she really should have had a lamp with her. And as we've said, some people see that the scriptures are the best place for God to speak to us, and these are the lamps. And this person I heard speak years ago, he said, look, there's different attitudes you can have to this lamp. He says, first of all, some people take the lamp and they stick it behind their backs. And what can you see if you've got the lamp behind your backs? Well, imagine it. If this lady in Africa had taken a torch out with her and she held it behind her back, even if it was switched on, what would she see? Nothing. Right? You need the torch in the right place. But then this speaker went on to say, there's other Christians, you know, and they get the lamp and they stick it there. And what can they see? Well, that's what they see. Not much. And if this lady in Africa had gone out and got a torch and put it there, she'd have still fallen down the hole. So he says, look, the best place for a lamp is here. And as we all know, if you go out at night and you hold a torch in the best position and you point it in the right direction, that's what you see. A light to your path. And this is what Tyndale wanted people to have. Tyndale wanted people to be able to see Jesus. He understood the value of the scriptures, how they point to Jesus, and how they help us recognize him. And he and many of his friends put their lives on the line to make the scriptures available to ordinary people like you and me. And so one question I've got to ask us is, how do we value them today? Do you remember Tyndale's last prayer? Lord, open the eyes of the King of England. Well, that was prayed in 1536. 1 year later, Henry VIII authorised the publication of a Bible that these days is known as Matthew's Bible. It was put in many churches, and one of the things about it, much of the New Testament, was Tyndale's work. The Old Testament was translated by a guy called Coverdale. 31 years after that, Henry VIII published the Great Bible with the intention of putting a Bible in English in every church in England. And then, of course, less than a century after he died, James I published the authorised version. Still, mostly Tyndale's work. Tyndale and other similar men and women stood up to a church and a political system which was intended to keep the common people in the dark. Do we value what they did for us? Through them, the Lord gave people in Europe and many other places the freedom to read, to believe, and to live by the light of Jesus Christ. Do we value their lives? Do we value what God did through them? Or do we take it for granted? And another question I've got for you. We see that in countries like ours, there's 500 years of freedom to believe in Jesus. It looks like the door's beginning to close and persecution is beginning to rise. That shouldn't surprise us, though. That map here is a map of the 50 countries in the world where Christians are most at risk of being persecuted. Right at the top of the list there's a blacklist one there, and that's North Korea. Almost every Christian in North Korea is in detention. The colour as it comes down there is where it's worse, but that's only the 50. Notice places like Russia aren't lit up there, and other places as well. And it's rising in different places. And should persecution come to us, the question is, how will each of us respond if in Britain Christians find themselves once again persecuted? Where will we hold the light which is meant to show you and others the way to Jesus Christ? Will we forget to pick it up? Will we hold it behind our backs? Will we hold it in front of our faces? Or will we hold it in the best place?